economies. So this panel will explore how to navigate these challenges. And may I invite the panelists on stage? Please join me in welcoming on stage Mr. Iñaki Amate, Chairman of the European Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, and our panelists, Mr. Jamil Anderlini, Regional Director of Europe of POLITICO, Mr. John Clarke, Fellow of Maastricht University and Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, Special Advisor on Trade, former head of the EU Delegation to the WTO and UN, Mr. Simon Lacey, Head of Digital Trade and Geopolitics of the World Economic Forum, and Professor Jiemian, Chairman of the Academic Advisory Council of Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. So please join me in welcoming them.
Perfect. Well, what can I say? I mean, this is one of the most exciting opportunities sometimes to discuss about this topic. So when we started to talk about this with Regina a few months ago, almost like a year ago, we never thought that it would become so hot and interesting. And especially, it's been a very interesting ride to actually prepare this panel because since I started to talk to some of you during the last months, we didn't realize that, I mean, the questions, the topic that we were discussing would evolve so much and almost changing every single week, right? So today I have the pleasure to have a fantastic panel of experts that are going to help me to debate with you a little bit about what is that is happening in the world today. And we are going to try to make it very dynamic. So we are going to have question for everyone, and then we go around and everybody can reply to those questions, and then we will open also for the floor for all of you to participate in the questions. And I'm really looking forward to see from what we get from the public. So first of all, I have here with me Mr. Jamil Anderlini, who's the Regional Director for POLITICO in Europe. Jamil has been living 22 years in China, worked for the Financial Times, before worked for South China Morning Post, and now is based in Europe with a regional director role. But he is half from New Zealand, half from the US, and born in the Middle East. So you are a true product of globalization, like a few of us are around here. So the first question for you, Jamil, is you just arrived from visiting Washington, and if I understood correctly, you've been twice in the most recent weeks. I think everyone here is probably wondering, you know, what are the corridors of power whispering today, and what do you see different from the previous times you've been in Washington?
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be back in Hong Kong. I lived here for 6 years running the Financial Times in Asia. Before that, long before that, I worked for the South China Morning Post. My first boss is sitting over there, Wang Xiangwei, gave me the job 20 years ago at South China Morning Post. So, 谢谢老大, 谢谢大哥. So I just got back from Washington just a couple of days ago, here to Hong Kong from Washington. And I was there 3 weeks ago for the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is a big 4,000 people in a ballroom. Usually the president comes, he wasn't there this time. Usually there's a comedian, no comedian this time. Usually lots of celebrities, there were no celebrities. The mood is apocalyptic, I would say, in traditional Washington. The best line I heard, or I've heard, is that this time, I don't know if any of you ever watched Jurassic Park, the movie Jurassic Park. So the best line I heard is that this time, Trump 2, the velociraptors have learned how to open the doors. Because the first time around, the people around Trump were not able to really use the sort of instruments of government to achieve their goals. But this time around, he's surrounded himself with people who have studied the tools of government, have studied how to disrupt the tools of government, and that's what they're doing. And so many people in Washington have lost their jobs or are losing their jobs. It's a really amazing sort of moment. In fact, I guess when you talk to people there, it really feels like Trump is a revolutionary president, and probably the most consequential president in America in terms of the sort of influence on the tools of government since FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Since the New Deal, no president has moved that fast and that momentously to change the US government. So from outside America, we can look at what's happening and say, oh, look at what he's doing with trade wars and look what he's doing with international relations. But inside America, the change feels much more powerful and consequential than under any president in our lifetime. So, and the last thing I'll say that I really noticed is the style, the fashion. A lot more cowboy boots, a lot more big hair, blonde, big hair. A lot of people more from sort of, you might say, hillbilly style than in the past. So it's really even noticeable in the way that people dress in Washington.
Did you change clothes to get there?
Oh, I don't even have any cowboy boots. I need to get some if I'm going to survive in Trump's swamp.
I guess we all have to. No, thanks a lot. We will get back then to the international part of it, right? I mean, this is all about trade, but I want to introduce John Clarke. And John is a fellow of Maastricht University and a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, special advisor of trade, former head of the European Union delegation to the WTO and the UN, and former Hong Kong government official for 10 years and colleague of Regina. Yeah. So tell us, what do you think that Trump's tariffs increases and threats will be short-lived, or it will be something that is going to represent a fundamental shift for the world order?
Well, thank you for the question. As politicians say, I'm glad you asked me that question. But let me first thank the Cervantes Foundation for the invitation, also to the Honourable Regina Rip. When I was a very young official in Hong Kong, I was terrified of Regina because of her towering intellect. And I'm glad to see that that intellect is undimmed over the years. So thank you, Regina. Well, I think in answer to your question, I would have to sort of paraphrase Chow En-lai. It's too early to tell. When Nixon asked him, what's the effect of the French Revolution, he said, a bit early. I think it's too early to tell. Certainly, Trump's policy is about trade. It's about reducing deficits with China and Europe in particular. It's about reshoring. It's about opening markets to US goods and, a lesser extent, services. It's about stopping anti-competitive practices in this region. So it is about trade, but fundamentally, the trade policy is about national security. And it's very significant that when, on Liberation Day, quote unquote, April the 2nd, when Trump announced the reciprocal tariff plan, which slapped 145% tariffs on China and other countries, that was done not under the US Trade Act, it was done under the Emergency Powers Act. So a completely political initiative bypassing Congress. So the trade policy of Trump 2.0 is all about national security. It's about, it's a futile, in my view, King Canute type attempt to deny or prevent a multipolar world and deny China's resurgence as one of the global leaders. We are already in a multipolar world, as the chief executive last night said during the speech, and as I've said today. That's a reality. Trump, like Canute, cannot push back the waves, so this is a completely futile attempt. I think the consequences are going to be long-term, not because of the tariffs. That will work itself out, I think, because the USA are shooting themselves in the foot big time with their tariff policy. It's causing inflation, it's causing recession, probably in the USA. It's causing job losses, so they lose more than anybody. But what's more of concern, I think, and more long-term and deep-seated is the fact that the USA is now a pariah, a rogue nation. Trust of the international community has gone completely. They've pulled out of the rules-based international order, and that doesn't come back quickly. And trust, as I know as a trade negotiator, once trust between people or countries is lost, it takes a long, long time to regain. As the singer Rihanna said, once a good girl's gone bad, it don't come back.
how true in personal relationships, like in trade, I think trust is everything, right? So, Simon, Lacey, thank you for joining us. Simon is the head of digital trade and geopolitics at the World Economic Forum. So thank you for being with us here today. I'm going to start with a very simple question. Who started the trade war?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you also to the Cervantes Policy Institute for inviting me. Really humbled to be on this stage when there are many others in the room who have spent sort of longer in the trenches. Craig Allen could be up here talking about this much more authoritatively than I could. But, you know, who started the trade war? I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think China's been preparing for this for a lot longer than anybody thinks, right? I mean, so we hear often this narrative that when Trump 2.0 launched, you know, his second trade war, China had been preparing for at least since the first trade war, and had sort of been preparing to face another round of sort of Trump's actions. But I think it sort of goes back a lot further than that. And I think if you look at the history over the sort of the last 20 years, a really fundamental shift was made in sort of 2006, where you had this indigenous innovation policy, which was sort of a recognition by China that interdependence could be a vulnerability, and that there were some technologies that just had to be manufactured, researched, created, and innovated independently, and including things like communications networks and cybersecurity capabilities and a lot of other sort of core competencies for a modern industrial economy. And so I think already in 2006, China sort of realized and started implementing a policy whereby they would reduce their vulnerability to a trade war, but then they were sort of vindicated in that choice, you know, at the latest by sort of 2017, 2018, with the launch of the first trade war, and now doubly so with Trump 2.0. I could say a lot more, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
No, perfect. Thank you very much for that introduction. And then we have Professor Jiemian, Chairman of the Academic Advisory Council of Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. And you were just explaining to me that you were raised in Shanghai, but you've been 60 trips to the US, right? So that's hard to beat. So tell us, what are the structural foundations for China and European cooperation?
Thank you very much. And I think this year marks the 50th anniversary of China-Europe diplomatic relations. And the world is definitely at a multipolarization. But how many major actors, different people have different explanations. If you ask the United States, Americans, they said the G2, China and the United States. If you ask Russia, 3 plus Russia. If you ask Europe, 4. Then you ask India, 5. But what I want to emphasize is China and Europe have their structural foundation for being major players in the world. Mainly 3 reasons. Number 1, both of them are big enough, rich enough, and smart enough, and long enough in this world arena. Number 2, their fundamental basis are economic and now technological cooperation. Of course, we have differences, competitions, but the mutual interdependence and mutual beneficiary still are the main one. And what is more, these are independent of any outside factors. Number three, both China and Europe, I think, hold the global governance imperatives like climate change and like the North-South relations, the UN 2030 agendas. So with all these, I think this is a very much important occasion to mark China-Europe's 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations and a new start for another more important years to come. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would probably add that from my perspective, it's also a little bit about understanding that both parties have like an interest in long-term stability, which is at the moment is not necessarily something that you see shared around the world. You know, we start to see also new wars starting in Pakistan, in India. So Europe and China probably have a little bit of that to share at the moment as well. And without leaving Europe and China, I have a question for you, Jamil. It's like there is a perception that there has been an opportunity now for Europe and China to start rebuilding relationships. We have seen some of the prime ministers visiting from Europe visiting China, and the indications from China also that there is an interest to, build in good terms communication and relationship with Europe. But then Xi Jinping went to Russia and stood next to Putin, and I think that probably put nervous a few people in Brussels, and you sit there, so you probably know a little bit about, what is the feeling at the moment in Brussels about that. So what else beyond good words we need to see on both sides to overcome some of those nervousness that we see? And what do you think the next steps from Europe will be in relation to China, and what role will Hong Kong play on all this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm based in Brussels for the last 3.5 years or so, and it was really interesting for me when I first arrived in Brussels because there was a lot of interest in China, but I perceived very little knowledge or expertise. It was really interesting how little Europe seemed to kind of understand what was happening in this part of the world, or sort of even, it was sort of like almost academic interest rather than a really engaged interest from Brussels. I think Professor Yang makes some very good points about the complementarity and the opportunity for closer relations between Europe and with China. However, I see some major, major obstacles. One, probably the most important one, is China's ongoing support for Russia in the war with Ukraine. For Europeans, this war on its doorstep, it feels existential. It feels like the return of a land war in Europe for the first time in 80 years. You talk to people, even in the far Western Europe, which is quite far away from Ukraine, actually, they feel it as a sort of, the return of land wars in Europe. And it's really very troubling. And when they see what Europe would like most is for China to unequivocally condemn Russia for this, and China's not going to do that. So that is a really major obstacle, and these two groups, two blocks coming to China and Europe coming together, being closer. Secondly, what I've perceived on the China side is that the main policy objective of China versus, vis-a-vis Europe is to make sure that Europe is not too close to America. And the Europeans hate this so much. They always go in to talk with Chinese visiting diplomats or Chinese visiting government officials, and the government officials say, you are blindly following America. And the Europeans are like, but we hate America. We're like, many of them are quite anti-American, and they hate more than anything to be told you're just following America. And that seems to be a real stumbling block when it comes to a relationship between Europe and China. Europe wants to be seen on its own, not really related to America, but always the point of America comes up. If I go back to what we're seeing in Washington and what it means for Europe, I actually believe quite strongly that Donald Trump's policies are not meant to make America great again. They're meant to make Europe great again, unintentionally. So I believe it's mega, not MAGA, actually, that's happening right now, thanks to Donald Trump. Because, actually, in Brussels, what I've come to realize, Brussels and the European Union is really a crisis machine. It doesn't work unless there's a crisis. In between crises, Europe does nothing. They have many, many, many meetings, many dinners and lunches and conferences, and it's wonderful, and they do nothing, really nothing. And then a crisis comes along, like Brexit, or the Euro crisis, or COVID, or whatever it is. The crisis comes along and Brussels gets its act together. And I believe that Donald Trump represents the biggest crisis that the European Union has ever faced, ever. And that's because all these other crises are, you know, they're important, they created problems for Europe, but Donald Trump is fundamentally questioning the underpinnings of 80 years of closer union in Europe, because he's saying America is no longer a reliable security guarantor. And that means Europe has to change every part of its policy. Europe has been allowed to outsource its defense for 80 years and spend all its money on social welfare, while somebody else, America, paid for its defense. And Donald Trump is saying, no more, you have to pay for your own defense, and Europe is freaking out. And so I actually think Europe is going to be much more focused internally on building up its military, on repairing some of its infrastructure. It's not really looking for a new sugar daddy, and China's not the sugar daddy it wants. Anyway, it's going to be focused internally. So I think that's another obstacle, ultimately, in very much closer relations between... Europe is not looking to replace America. Europe has to replace what America's provided with its own strength. So that's what's coming. And that's why I'm very actually optimistic about Europe.
Perfect, thanks. You didn't answer my question, though, because we still didn't cover, you know, what is the next step towards China and the role of Hong Kong. Do you want to think about that, or do you want to...
Look, I think Hong Kong has a role to play. It has right next to my office, there's a Hong Kong government office, official office there. I think that Hong Kong can be a bridge. I think Hong Kong remains a very, very important financial center. However, the fact remains, to be very frank, in the last few years, many countries, from the UK to the United States to most countries in Europe, have started to see Hong Kong as more and more the same as mainland China. That is just what's happened over the last few years. So, and that's quite hard for Hong Kong to push back on because, you know, in some ways it's a reality. So Hong Kong needs to continue to play a bridging role, and Hong Kong can play a bridging role, but it's harder than it used to be. That's what I'd say.
Okay, thanks. Now you answer. That's very fair. So, John, we've started to see some parties, some countries going to the US and started to try to negotiate individually. You know, we saw first the British, and then we saw now China recently. What can the rest of the world do in order to address the tariffs and the trade war that started by the US?
Well, I will answer that question completely, but could I react first to a couple of points that Jamil said?
Yeah, definitely.
First of all, on this idea that China is trying to say to Europe, you know, you are too close to the USA. I don't see that myself, frankly. The EU is trying to navigate between Scylla and Charybdis at the moment, in that respect. And secondly, on the European perception of China's support for Russia, this is an existential concern for Europe. It's incomprehensible to many people. I'm not giving a personal opinion here. That China, which for decades has insisted on non-interference, on the inviolability of national borders, supports Russia. Okay? Having said that, I think China has a very good point to make when it points out European countries' hypocrisy in supporting Ukraine, but at the same time arming the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So, you know, I think Europe is quite hypocritical in this respect, and that makes it understandable that China has had a different view on Russia-Ukraine. Now, on the question you asked, and I will get to that. So, faced with the Trump tariff wars, I think countries have several options: negotiation, retaliation, litigation, diversification, or capitulation. They're not all mutually exclusive, by the way. Obviously, the ideal way forward is to negotiate with the US administration to try and calm things down, get rid of the tariffs. But I'm afraid that equal, balanced negotiations are not in the Trump playbook. Has anyone in the audience read Trump's The Art of the Deal? Don't bother. I can summarize it in a few words. I win, you lose. Get it? It's that. I mean, Trump's approach is zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser. We all know, those of us who have been trade negotiators, the only agreements that stick are ones which are balanced, where both sides gain to some extent. Yeah? I think China learned a hard lesson under Trump 1.0 with the phase 1 negotiations, which were very unbalanced, very unequal. And China and Hong Kong know a lot about unequal treaties, okay? And I think that China is not making that mistake again. It was right to retaliate very strongly, because that's the only language that Trump understands. The UK made a big mistake, I think, in negotiating with Trump, accepting a deal which not only maintained tariffs on UK exports, it actually, the UK introduced WTO illegal preferential access to US exporters for ethanol and beef. So the UK did the international community a very big disservice, in my view, by normalizing WTO illegal treatment. The EU is trying to, as always, play several games at the same time here, negotiating with the USA, diversifying to avoid dependencies, trying to get deals with Mercosur, India, ASEAN countries, etc. A very wise policy, which China has also been doing for many years, but also preparing to retaliate against the USA if negotiations fail, which they probably will. So what the EU is doing is like Roosevelt said, talk softly but carry a big stick. So, my advice, for what it's worth, to countries who are too small to retaliate, who need to negotiate with the US and with the Trump administration, if you negotiate tariff deals, agreements, please make sure they are WTO compatible. Do not break WTO law even more, because that is going to normalize this corrupt, illegal behavior coming out of Washington.
Just one more thing, John. I mean, do you think that the world missed the trick by not... But when the UK went and signed this agreement, did the world miss a trick, an opportunity to align against the policies that Trump was putting forward?
Absolutely. I mean, we're in a world where coordination is needed, but is missing. I've been arguing for months that we need a new sort of Congress of Vienna, yeah, where the major economies and powers in the world can actually try and find a modus vivendi. Yeah? That's not going to happen anytime soon. I'm pushing very hard for the EU to take the leadership in coordinating with China, with Canada, with the ASEAN countries and others, to have a coordinated, solid, uniform response to the Trump tariff, reciprocal tariff plan. Fully consistent with international law, WTO law, but the UK has broken ranks even before it started.
Yeah, that's something to think about. If we change a little bit topic, Simon, and we look at the US economy today, in terms of productivity, the US economy is not that different from the European Union, but when you remove the technological sector, actually the US is way ahead in terms of competitiveness and productivity. How important is the technology sector and the service sector for the US in the trade war? And do you see that they have somehow different or sometimes contradictory intent than some other sectors and they probably are negotiating in a different direction than other sectors are.
Right. I mean, technology is definitely a key part of, I think, the whole trade war, but also strategic competition. I mean, it was both. I mean, Mao from the beginning was adamant that China had to be at the technological cutting edge in order to avoid a repeat of, the century of humiliation. And I think at least since sort of the end of the Second World War, when Vannevar Bush submitted a report to Roosevelt, who I don't believe ever read it because he died before he could read it, just sort of saying how important technology was to the US. First of all, ending the war on its own terms, but how important it would be going forward. So I don't think either of the two governments have any misconceptions about just how important technology is for national security, for national competitiveness. And in terms of, I mean, your next question on services, I think, one of the things that's really been missing from the debate and been missing from an understanding of trade policy from the Trump side is just how important trade in services is. And there's a lot of sort of bemoaning the loss of the manufacturing economy and, talk of the China shock. But what you have to remember, I mean, if you remember Bill Clinton talking in 1997 about the internet and the promise of the digital economy and the information superhighway, that was the whole point. I mean, the whole point was to move the US towards a service-based digital economy, and the manufacturing sector was just going to be collateral damage. And that was premised on a recognition that actually the services economy is much more high sort of value add. And that's where the US would lead, and that's where it would have its competitive advantage, and that was certainly true for quite a long time. And I think all of this push to bring manufacturing back is sort of trying to rewind the clock. I mean, Kenneth Rogoff has made this point recently on a podcast, that there seems to be this sort of nostalgic yearning for a return, to the 1960s, the peak of America's manufacturing prowess. Just like before, there was this idealization of like the agricultural life as America was moving from an agrarian economy to a manufacturing-based economy. So I think, services are really sort of the future. China is also moving towards a services-based economy. Services make a huge part of domestic GDP. And Chinese firms are starting to become much more competitive in also exporting services now, whether it's cloud computing or whether it's e-commerce. And so really the future of contestability and national competitiveness is really in services. And that seems to be a point that's largely missed. Of course, you've got to be able to make things, but it's not the be-all and end-all of national competitiveness. Thank you.
Thanks. Professor Jiemian, we started to talk about the structural foundation for the relations between China and Europe. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what do you think are some of the challenges that we already started to discuss, but more importantly, what are the ways out and the strategic way forward for rebuilding that relationship between Europe and China?
Thank you very much. I think there are many strategic ways forward, but I want to emphasize three. Number one, each side, I meant China and Europe, have to strategically looking at each other as independent major player in the world. That is very important, and we hope that Europe could be continuing on its way of unity, of diversity, and also try to move ahead with its strategic autonomy rather than be interfered by outside forces. By the way, just now, when we were talking about China would complain that Europe was influenced by the United States, I don't think that's the major reason. We know because transatlantic relations are allies. We are partners. We are talking at two different levels. And China would never think that we could drive a wedge into this alliance system. However, we think we could do that China and Europe could work on our common grounds. Second, I think that China and Europe should and could continue to build up the strategic dialogue mechanisms. To China, as to the United States, sometimes it's very difficult because, as Dr. Henry Kissinger said, European Union is a monster with 27 heads. You don't know whom to talk over the phone. But we think now China and the European had the institutional, and we need to keep it, and then also have promotion of bilateral relations, like China, Germany, China, France, and China, Slovenia, so on and so forth, because different country has different demandings. The last thing we do not want to see is when you should have, Europe should have its single identity, then you say, oh, we are of 27 or 28 countries. And last but not least is that we should continue the sub-nation, like region to region, city to city. Shanghai is a sister city to Hamburg, and we worked very well. And Hong Kong is a special case. Yesterday, I heard several times super connector, super platform, super bridge, and we must use in a very proactive and constructive way. I don't like say that Hong Kong is what now, because most of the Europeans look at China, look at Hong Kong through the BBC lessons, CNN or New York Times, but very few people read China Daily or South China Morning Post, let alone have such kind of candidate direct dialogue. So these should be strategically building up, and I'm quite confident in the 10, 20 years time, Hong Kong can play a better role because China would be even better, and Europe could come back to their unities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamil, both China and the US claimed certain victory over the result of the temporary agreement reached over a week ago. What do you think really happened for them to reach this first step, and what lies ahead? Is this 90 days a way to gain time for the US to sign more agreements with anti-China clauses with other superpowers to weaken China's position? Or do you think that this is a way for them to start thinking what else they need to put on the table with China?
Yeah, thank you. I think that is probably the idea. It's going to fail miserably, right? So Donald Trump would like to take this time to get other countries all lined up and let's all gang up on China. But he's done so much damage. I mean, we had a speaker here earlier talking about trying to annex Canada, trying to take over Greenland. The trust in Donald Trump is so low, and his administration, they've done so much damage to relations with traditional allies that there's just no way that he's going to line up anybody to sort of be in his camp, I don't think, especially towards China. If you look at what he does, I think it's very good that you mentioned the art of the deal, because fundamentally he hasn't changed. And there's that movie, I watched it on the plane, The Apprentice. I don't know if anyone's seen it. He learned his craft in real estate in Manhattan in the 1970s and 1980s. It's called escalation dominance. It's called, the idea that you threaten the other guy so much that they eventually make a deal that's like down here. So, 200, what did it get up to? 240% was the highest tariffs, and now it's back down to 30%, and probably it'll be somewhere a bit lower. His credibility is not very high. And if I watch as an outside observer, I would say China's response has been quite clever, to sort of just sit back and say, oh, you want to give us those tariffs, we'll give you these tariffs, and then you drop them, we'll drop them. You put them up, we'll put them up. It's a pretty good way to deal with Donald Trump. And countries, if you see the countries that don't capitulate, again, back to your sort of categories, which are good ones, the ones that don't capitulate end up usually getting quite a good deal in the end. So I think what happened was Donald Trump blinked. That's what happened in Geneva. I think it was James Carville, one of these Democrats said, when I come back in my next life, I want to come back as the bond market, because everybody's scared of the bond market. And in the end, even Donald Trump is scared of the bond market. Yeah. And that's what did it in the end. And he's undermining the value of the dollar, actually. And that is again, back to my sort of big changes that are happening. That's a big one. And so you should invest in the euro, is what I'd say.
So, John, I'll give you a chance to follow up on this one if you want, and then maybe wrap it up also with another question that is similar to this one. So do you think that is this trade policy is Trump's trade policy about trade, or is it more about national security?
Well, I think I explained in an earlier intervention that it's at root, it's about national security. It's about futilely trying to prevent China's resurgence as one of the poles internationally, as it was until 1700. It will fail, and we're seeing that Trump's trade policy is failing on all fronts already. And it's having the opposite effect, as Jamil said. It's making America smaller again, and other countries are moving into alliances with anybody but USA. The chief executive last night in his speech at dinner referred to the deals last week between China and Latin America. Latin American countries now see China as more of a reliable ally than they do the USA. Inconceivable 1 year ago. Yeah? So I think that is a sign of the times. I want to come back to this issue of where the EU will be positioned. The question has been raised, will the EU have to now sort of choose between China and the USA? I used to say until about a few months ago, Europe is 3,500 miles from the US, it's 7,000 miles from China. And in terms of political relations and economic policy, the positioning on the spectrum is quite similar. That has changed completely. So, USA is trying to push Europe to gang up with it against China. That will not happen. Europe is big enough to stand on its own 2 feet. It's the biggest trading entity in the world. It's now fairly equidistant between the 2 other behemoths in the world. And I think this year we will see genuine efforts on both sides to improve relations, which have been difficult in the last 5 years, let's be honest. But I think given the unstable political and economic climate caused by the USA, EU and China will try where they can to cooperate much more closely and give support, real support, not just talk, but real support to multilateralism and to peaceful international solutions. And I think that gives me a lot of hope, actually, in the year ahead.
Thank you. I think we're going to move into some of the questions that came from the audience, because we have quite many and very interesting ones, actually. So, Simon, maybe we start with you. How might the current trade dynamics reshape global economic power structures in the next decade?
Right, yes. I mean, look, that's something that we've been sort of trying to work on at the World Economic Forum. I mean, when I sort of came to that job, head of trade and geopolitics, the question was, you know, how to actually do something of value to our community, whether it's government officials that we deal with or the many partners that we have, corporates. And really it was a tough question, because we're not going to solve the US-China impasse. I mean, we can't do that. But where can we sort of add value to the relationships we have? And it was, you know, this was exactly sort of one of the questions. So how do you respond if you're facing sort of a decade of uncertainty? And I think, you know, one of the things we've looked at in great detail is national security that John Clarke has mentioned a few times now. This has sort of gone to the top of the policy priority list for many countries, national security and economic security. And so one of the things we're doing is, and one of the things we're doing with the Cervantes Policy Institute here in Hong Kong, is to sort of look at and discuss with policymakers from both the national security side of the policy debate, as well as trade experts and trade negotiators, to sort of hear these different sort of worldviews that they have, and try and understand where we can come up with some guidance for firms and companies on how to navigate these very sort of difficult times where you know, national security considerations are being attributed to almost everything. I mean, the last administration used to talk about small yard, high fence. That was Jake Sullivan that used to talk about that. And so the question was, well, how small is the yard and how high is the fence? And the reality was there was a very, very big yard and there was no fence, because in the end, you know, something as innocuous as like a social dating app, Grindr, was kind of seen as a national security threat. And so it wasn't just semiconductors or artificial intelligence, it was kind of everything was in the yard. And that's sort of, those are dialogues that we're sort of helping to lead and try and come out with some guidance for firms, but also to help so government officials, particularly on the defence and national security side, sort of better understand some of the unintended consequences of their actions. So that's one thing we're doing. And we're also really sort of trying to help our partners understand how to better develop geopolitical radar and geopolitical muscle. And so what we found is there are a lot of firms that have long been dealing with political risk. So, you know, think energy, think mining, extractive industries. These are firms that have been dealing with geopolitical, let's say, disruptions or vulnerabilities for many decades, and they really know how to build that into their decision making. But other firms in other sectors, this is very new to them. So you know, the platform companies, you know, and the whole sort of digital economy, consumer electronics, the idea that they would be considered a national security risk is very new to them, and so we're sort of helping partners who are sort of new to this world better understand how to navigate it a little bit more effectively. And that's been very rewarding, and it's really produced some very interesting insights from my side. So I think the reason why I got this job is because I used to work for Huawei Technologies when they were navigating, you know, this very tough period. from sort of 2017 to 2019, and they're still going through tough times. And I think that even having gone through that, I'm sort of still learning from many of the experiences and insights that that we're getting from some of our more experienced partners. I don't know if that answers your question, but
close enough.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Professor Yang, I have a question here that says, most countries depend on the US and or China. As things develop, will third countries need to choose one or the other?
Thank you. Before I answer this question to choose side, I want to talk about multilateralism, just John mentioned. And this year again marks the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. In the past 80 years, the United Nations and the international system it represents has never met such unprecedented challenges about its survival for another 10 or 20 years, because the United States under Trump 2.0 decided to undercut, and it withdrew from many mechanisms and institutions. And now it's real time whether Donald Trump represents the end of the world order 80 years ago or the beginning of a new order. And I think the United States under Trump 2.0 maybe would demand a crashing landing. And Russia asks for a hard landing. And China working very carefully for soft landing. And some other smaller players, because they are too small and not powerful enough, they have to accept or call for no landing. So multilateralism is the very important way that the world should think about, not only about the principles, but also the roadmaps and how to do it. And for doing this, we need GPS, right? Direction. So my answer to choose the side. Nowadays, these small and medium-sized countries are no longer the ones 100 years ago, because at that time they had to accept what the major powers decided. Like China could only waited in the corridor at the Versailles meeting, and for the end of the World War II, only the United States, the Soviet Union, plus Britain. But now, the small and medium-sized countries, they get united. For instance, 10 ASEAN countries, now we may say 10 plus 1, they pushed forward ASEAN centrality. The United States would not recognize the centrality of these small countries, but they at least on surface now don't challenge that. And we also see the Latin America. They have the Latin America community and African Union, so on and so forth. So number one, they are not strong enough to be an independent actor or polar of the world. Number two, they try not to be 100% passive receiver. And they want to have their voice heard, have their representation, and enhanced their saying in the institutional building. So, like Singapore, like Indonesia, so they won't choose between the United States or China. And in reality, they might lay more emphasis on their economic relation with China and have more security dependence on the United States. But sooner or later, that will change too. But it takes a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from Ms. Regina Ip that wanted to ask something to the panel. So,
yes, it's a general question. There are many in this room who has worked in international trade and always supported WTO rules. But U.S. has been defying these rules. So, as Jamil said, it was the bond markets, signals on the bond markets, which probably caused a U-turn in the U.S. position on reciprocal tariffs. How are we going to? What levers do we have? What levers that WTO has to compel U.S. to abide by its rules, or a new Congress of Vienna? How are we going to get to that?
Thank you, Regina, for the question. I mean, you mentioned again the Congress of Vienna, and I think it was John that mentioned it originally. I remember thinking, if we're going to have a new Congress of Vienna, we've also got to have another Waterloo. And so, what is going to be our Waterloo? Let's not forget Waterloo was a battle, and it was very bloody. There were a lot of dead bodies. So let's hope that we don't have to have another Waterloo before we can have another Congress of Vienna. I think we'd all rather go back to a world where we had a sort of functioning WTO and a functioning dispute settlement system that was able to arbitrate between these great powers. But you have to remember, even in the heyday of the WTO's sort of rules-based system, when it worked relatively well, it was also unable to police some of the biggest states. I mean, think about beef hormones. Think about bananas. I'm sorry, I'm sort of bullying the EU here, but think about the US and online gambling, right? I mean, there were a lot of really high-level disputes, or China audiovisual services and payment services. There were a lot of high-level disputes that the WTO was just not able to resolve, but those were the exception. I mean, in most cases, the WTO was able to provide redress to trade problems, but not in a time frame that was actually meaningful to the traders and the operators on the ground. I just wanted to add very quickly one point that you mentioned, Professor Yang, when you were saying that Trump wants to remake the system. It's actually a very interesting observation, because it sort of begs the question, which one is actually the revisionist power here? Is it China or is it the new Trump administration? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a reasonable question to ask. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. We're running out of time.
John, do you want to?
Well, I think until recently, it was possible in the WTO to resolve trade disputes, even the ones you mentioned. You're from Australia, so I understand where you're coming from. The hormone beef dispute, bananas. In the end, WTO dispute settlement settled those cases. The EU lost in both cases, but paid compensation or changed their law. Okay, so the WTO worked until, in its judicial function, until the USA decapitated the dispute settlement appellate body. So now, any country can breach WTO law and the USA is pioneering that way, without any enforcement, without any sanctions, without any recourse to change that. That is the great sort of tragedy. And that's why, you know, one of the options for countries in their reaction to US illegal trade barriers, tariff actions, is litigation WTO. There'll be no short-term relief through litigation because the system has been asphyxiated for the time being. But it's very important to give a public signal that the USA is an international pariah when it comes to its disregard for international law, which goes as far as in ICC, WHO, the Paris Climate Treaty, many other institutions which the USA is pulling out of or trying to dismantle. So very important that litigation does take place to show that the US is a pariah, is in breach of its international obligations. It's important also to send a signal that the rest of the world is not accepting or normalizing illegal behavior, which is, I think, is the biggest risk. Yeah? And thirdly, WTO litigation will be important for countries who may at a later stage need to retaliate. It gives them a legal cover to do that without being in breach themselves of their own WTO obligations. And as a former Hong Kong government trade negotiator in the Uruguay round, I'm a very, very strong believer in multilateralism. It's been the biggest protector of Hong Kong's interests for decades, and we must not do down the WTO. We must really support it, particularly for small and medium-sized economies who need that shelter of legality and multilateralism.
Thank you very much, John. And just to conclude on the same words that you were saying, let's hope that Hong Kong keeps playing an important role as a super connector in a multilateral world, because we really need it to get out from the situation where we are today. Please join me to thank the panelists today, and a great round of applause to everyone. Thank you.